My mother stood up at my father's 70th birthday dinner, tapped her glass with a fork, and announced to 40's guests that the lake house was going under contract Monday morning, a clean $2.3 million sale to a developer who wanted to tear down my grandfather's boathouse and put up 6 units. She looked directly at me when she said it. A fresh start for this family, without anyone dragging their feet. What she didn't know, standing there in her navy silk with a glass of champagne in her hand, was that the paperwork she was so proud of, arriving Monday morning, was worth exactly nothing, because the deed to that house had belonged to me for 6 years already, quietly, legally, recorded at the county courthouse, under my name and no one else's. My name is Mira Holloway, though everyone except my mother has called me Mira since I was 7. Back when a kindergarten teacher shortened it without asking, and it simply stuck for everyone but her. I was 36 years old, sitting at a linen-covered table with a forkful of untouched salmon. When my mother tried to sell a house she no longer owned, in front of everyone she'd invited to watch her do it. I work as a forensic auditor, which means I spend my professional life reading other people's financial records for the small inconsistencies that tell the real story underneath the official one. A shell company here, a backdated transfer there, the gap between what someone claims happened and what the paper trail actually shows. 2 months before that dinner, I'd spent 3 weeks unraveling a client's inventory fraud entirely from mismatched shipping dates. Nobody else in the company had thought to compare against invoice timestamps. I'm good at my job. I've built an entire career on the specific, unglamorous skill of not believing people until their documents agree with them. And for 36 years, somehow I never once thought to apply that same skill to my own family, until the week 2 envelopes arrived within 4 days of each other and changed the shape of everything I thought I knew. I should say, too, that my mother isn't a cartoonish villain in this story. Not really, and I think it's worth being honest about that rather than flattening her into someone easier to dislike. She threw me a genuinely lovely graduation party when I finished my certification exams. She called every Sunday for years, faithfully, even during the stretches when neither of us had much new to say. She simply also believed, with real conviction, that Paisley's wedding mattered in a way my business never quite did. And that belief shaped 2 decades of small decisions before it ever showed up as something as large as a birthday toast about a house she didn't actually own. The lake house belonged to my grandfather, Warren Holloway, before it belonged to anyone else. A rambling 3-bedroom cabin on Loon Lake that he built with 2 carpenter friends the summer after he came home from the Navy, hauling lumber up a dirt axe road in a truck that reportedly broke down twice before the frame was even finished. A story he told at every family gathering, with slightly more embellishment each year. It was a house our family had gathered at every August for as long as I could remember. Screen doors that never quite sat flush. A dock that needed new boards almost every spring. The specific smell of citronella and lake water that I still associate with feeling entirely uncomplicatedly happy. My sister Paisley hated the lake house, the mosquitoes, the lack of cell service, the outhouse smell that never quite left the boathouse no matter how many times someone repainted it. I loved every inch of it. When I was 12, Pop handed me a small brass key on a length of fishing line and told me it opened the boathouse, that it was mine to keep, that I was the only grandchild who ever actually asked to help him varnish the canoe instead of complaining about the bugs. Everyone else wants the lake, he told me. You're the only one who wants the work. I wore that key around my neck every summer for the next 15 years, long after it stopped fitting any lock that still existed. Because Pop replaced the boathouse door twice, and never once thought to tell me, the key didn't open anything anymore. I think, now, that he liked what the key meant more than what it opened, and so did I. I remember one August, I must have been 16, sitting on the dock with Pop after everyone else had gone to bed, both of us watching loons call across the water, and asking him why he never seemed to mind that I asked so many questions about the house's maintenance. The septic system, the roof's age, the boathouse's foundation, when Paisley found the same topics unbearably boring. He was quiet for a while, the way he got before saying something he'd clearly thought about more than once. "Because you ask like you're planning to still be here in 40 years, he said. "Most people ask like they're passing through." I didn't understand, at 16, how much weight that observation was actually carrying. "I understand it completely now," I asked him. That same night, half joking, what would happen to the houses someday? And he laughed and told me not to worry about that for a long while yet, that he intended to be varnishing that canoe well into his 90s out of pure spite, for anyone who assumed otherwise. He wasn't wrong about the spite. He simply hadn't accounted for a heart that gave out quietly in his sleep 2 decades sooner than either of us expected. Which I think, looking back, is exactly why he'd already quietly made sure the answer to my 16-year-old question wouldn't be left to chance. Pop died when I was 29, quietly in his sleep, in the same lake house bedroom he'd slept in for 50 years. The estate paperwork my mother inherited from his attorney's office listed the lake house among the jointly held assets passing to her and her 2 siblings, and I knew that, because I'd helped her organize the paperwork myself, sitting at her kitchen table for 3 straight weekends, translating probate language into plain English while Paisley found reasons to be elsewhere. None of us had any reason to question it. Pop's longtime attorney, a meticulous but old-fashioned man named Fitch, who still kept most of his records on paper, had apparently never updated the estate's asset inventory to reflect a quitclaim deed he himself had filed with the county a year earlier. A private, unannounced transfer that existed, legally, the moment it was recorded, whether or not anyone's internal paperwork caught up to reflect it. I never thought much about my own name not appearing anywhere in the probate documents I'd helped assemble. I was 30 at the time, still building my practice, still the daughter my mother described at dinner parties as the responsible one, though God knows responsible doesn't pay for a wedding. Paisley had married at 26, in a ceremony my mother still mentioned with something close to reverence. I had built a business instead, and in my family, a business was simply a wedding that never happened. For the past year, my mother had been dropping hints about the lake house being too much upkeep for 3 siblings who all live 4 states apart, always at family dinners, always in the tone of someone thinking out loud rather than someone building a case. Paisley agreed enthusiastically every time, citing property taxes she'd apparently researched in some detail for a house she'd visited exactly twice since Pop's funeral. I said, more than once, that I'd help cover maintenance costs myself if that was really the concern, and watched the offer land nowhere useful. My mother changing the subject with the practiced ease of someone who'd already decided the outcome and simply hadn't announced it yet. There was a Thanksgiving, about 8 months before that dinner, when my mother mentioned, almost offhand, that a developer had approached her about the lake property, just to see what it might be worth someday. I remember feeling a small, cold flicker of unease at someday, sliding so easily into a conversation about actual dollar figures, and asking whether she was seriously considering it. "We're just exploring options, Mira," she said, in the tone she used when she wanted a topic closed rather than discussed. I let it close. I've thought since about how many topics I let close over the years, simply because pressing further felt like more conflict than the moment seemed to warrant. The dinner where she finally announced it was my father's 70th birthday, held at the country club my parents had belonged to since before I was born. 40 guests in their good clothes, a string quartet my mother had hired, despite my father's stated preference for literally anything else. I'd flown in that morning from my own city 3 states away, brought a gift I'd spent real time choosing, and sat through 2 hours of toasts before my mother rose with her champagne glass and delivered the announcement that would end up costing her considerably more than the lake house was ever worth. "A fresh start for this family," she said, glass raised, eyes finding mine across the table with the particular precision of a woman who had rehearsed exactly where to look when she said it, without anyone dragging their feet. Several guests glanced toward me, not quite subtly, because everyone at that table had heard some version of the story by then. The daughter, who never made time for the lake house, conveniently minus the 2 months I'd spent there the summer. I helped Pop rebuild the dock, minus the 15 years I'd worn a key to a door that no longer existed simply because it meant something to both of us. My father's oldest friend, seated 2 chairs down, actually patted my hand sympathetically under the table, as though I were the one who needed comforting through my own mother's toast. I smiled, said congratulations, and passed the bread basket, because I had learned, over 36 years, that the loudest response is rarely the most useful one. My father, seated beside my mother, looked uncomfortable in a way I recognized from decades of watching him absorb her decisions without quite endorsing them, but he said nothing either, raising his own glass along with everyone else. I also happened to know, sitting there in my good dress with untouched salmon cooling in front of me, that the sale my mother was celebrating couldn't actually happen the way she thought it could, because the county recorder's office had a document on file that would have surprised every single person at that table, including me 6 months earlier. The first envelope arrived 4 days before that dinner, forwarded from my old apartment by a mail service I'd forgotten I still paid for, the forwarding label itself slightly crumpled from however many hands it had passed through to reach me. It was from a law firm in the small town nearest the lake, the letterhead unfamiliar, the return address belonging to an attorney named Harriet Ossie, who, the letter explained, had recently taken over the closed files of a retired colleague, my grandfather's longtime attorney, a man named Fitch who'd handled Pop's affairs for decades and passed away himself 2 years earlier. Miss Ossie was writing, she said, because a client notification requirement she'd only recently discovered, while digitizing Fitch's old files, required her to formally confirm, for the record, that a 2018 quitclaim deed, transferring the Loon Lake property to Mira Halloway, had been properly recorded with the county, and remained valid and unchallenged. She apologized for the 6-year delay, explained it as an oversight in Fitch's paper filing system that predated his retirement, and asked whether I'd like copies of the original documents sent to my current address. I read that letter standing in my own kitchen, coffee going cold on the counter, 3 separate times before the words settled into something I could actually process. 2018. The year before Pop died, a deed transferring the lake house to me, alone, 6 years before that dinner, that I had never once been told existed. I called the number on the letterhead within the hour, half expecting some kind of clerical error, and instead spent 40 minutes on the phone with Harriet, who patiently walked me through exactly what she'd found in Fitch's files, and how confident she was, professionally, that the document was fully valid. The second envelope came 3 days later and had nothing directly to do with the first, or so I assumed until I opened it. It was from my Aunt Delphine, my mother's younger sister, a woman I saw perhaps twice a year, and had always liked without ever being especially close to. The kind of aunt who sent thoughtful birthday cards but never quite made it into the center of family drama one way or another. She'd been going through some of Pop's old storage boxes, finally 6 years after his death, clearing out a unit she and Rory had been paying to maintain since the funeral, and had simply never gotten around to emptying. She found a letter he'd apparently written and never sent, tucked into a book he'd left specifically to me in his will. A battered field guide to lake birds I'd flipped through a dozen times without ever finding the letter folded into the back cover, tucked behind a folded map of the lake's shoreline I'd always assumed was simply part of the book. Delphine mailed it to me without reading it herself, she said in the short note she attached, because it had my name on the envelope, and that felt like enough of an instruction. I don't know what this is, she wrote. But Pop wasn't a man who wrote things down unless he meant for them to matter. Pop's handwriting was smaller than I remembered, careful in the way older men's handwriting sometimes gets when they know they're writing something they want to last. Mira T. It read. I did the paperwork with Fitch back in March. Quiet, the way you'd want it, because I know you'd have argued me out of it if I'd asked first. The house goes to you, not to be inherited later and fought over. But now, while I can still watch you decide what to do with it, everyone else wants the lake. You're the only one who ever wanted the work. That was true when you were 12 with that key around your neck. And it's still true. Don't let anyone tell you that loving a thing quietly means you loved it less. I know exactly how much you loved it. I made sure the house would be yours to protect, not yours to sell. I read that letter 4 more times that evening, sitting at my kitchen table long after the coffee had gone completely cold, and found myself, absurdly, getting up to open the drawer where the boathouse key had lived for years, taking it out, holding it in my palm the way I used to hold it against my collarbone on hot August mornings. Pop had known, writing that letter, that I might not read it for years, might not read it at all, if Delphine hadn't finally gone through those boxes. He'd trusted the deed itself to do the real work, and kept the letter as something softer, something meant only for me rather than for any courtroom or title company. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading that letter, the boathouse key still, absurdly, sitting in my palm 3 feet from where I was sitting, and understood that I had been carrying proof of my grandfather's love around my neck for 15 years, without ever knowing he'd made it legally permanent too. I called Harriet O.C. the next morning and asked her to walk me through exactly what my mother would and wouldn't be able to do with the property, given what she almost certainly didn't know. Harriet explained it in terms I understood immediately. Given my own work, my mother and her siblings had inherited jointly through Pop's will, which meant, on paper, they believed they owned the property as tenants in common and could sell it with a simple majority agreement among the 3 of them. What none of them apparently knew was that the will's disposition of the lake house had been rendered moot a full year before Pop's death, when he'd quietly executed the quitclaim deed transferring the property directly to me. A will only controls what a person still owns at the time of their death. Pop hadn't owned the lake house when he died. He'd already given it away, cleanly, legally, to someone whose name never once appeared in the document my mother had spent a year showing to real estate agents. The estate inventory should have reflected the transfer and removed the property from probate entirely, Harriet explained, but Fitch's asset list was compiled from an older file he never cross-checked against his own recent filings before he retired. It's an easy mistake for a one-man practice to make, and an expensive one for everyone downstream of it. I've seen it happen twice before in 6 years of taking over closed files, and both times it ended in a conversation not unlike this. 1. They're about to sign a purchase agreement, I told Harriet, for a house that isn't theirs to sell. Then I'd recommend, she said with the calm of someone who had clearly delivered versions of this news before, that we get you formally on record before that agreement closes, so there's no ambiguity for the title company or the buyer once this becomes public. I asked her to file whatever was needed, quietly, without contacting my mother directly. Harriet didn't ask why. I suspect she'd handled enough estates to already know. We spoke twice more before that Monday, working out exactly how the disclosure should happen. Harriet recommended waiting for the closing itself, rather than confronting my mother privately beforehand, explaining that a private conversation would only give her time to consult her own attorney and potentially delay or complicate matters, whereas the closing table put the title company's own compliance obligations on our side, forcing an immediate, undeniable resolution rather than a drawn-out dispute. I agreed, though some part of me wondered, even then, whether I was choosing the most efficient path or simply the one that let the facts do the confronting instead of me. I didn't say anything at the birthday dinner itself. I passed the breadbasket, complimented the string quartet, and let my mother enjoy her toast because I'd already decided, sitting in Harriet's office 2 days earlier, that the reveal deserved a room and a birthday dinner surrounded by extended family and my mother's oldest friends was not the room I wanted to spend on it. I wanted the room where the actual sale was supposed to happen. A room with paperwork on the table already, where the facts could simply speak for themselves without anyone accusing me of staging a scene. The closing was scheduled for the following Monday, 10 a.m., at a title company office downtown. My mother had mentioned the time and place at least 3 times over dinner, unable to help herself, the way people can't help repeating good news, even when no one's asked twice. I called Harriet Sunday night and asked whether she could attend in person. She could, and did, meeting me for coffee an hour beforehand to walk through, one final time, exactly how she planned to present the document. I arrived at the title company at 9:55 minutes before my mother, Paisley, and my uncle Rory were scheduled to sit down with the buyer's representative and sign the purchase agreement my mother had been so proud of at dinner. The waiting room smelled like burnt coffee and new carpet, fluorescent light doing nothing kind for anyone's expression. My mother's face when she saw me there moved through confusion, irritation, and something close to alarm in about 4 seconds. "Mira, what are you doing here? This doesn't concern you." "It does, actually," I said. "I brought someone who can explain why." Harriet introduced herself calmly, professionally, the way I imagined she'd introduced herself in 100 rooms, exactly like this one. "Mrs. Halloway, before this closing proceeds, I need to make you and the title company aware of a document on file with the county recorder that affects the property you're here to sell." She placed a folder on the table between them, the recorded quitclaim deed, dated 2018, Pop's signature clear and unmistakable at the bottom, my name typed cleanly into the grantee line. "This property was transferred in full to Mira Halloway, a full year before your father's passing. It was never part of his estate. It was never part of the will you and your siblings inherited through. Legally, you have no ownership interest to sell." My mother stared at the document for a long moment, the color leaving her face the way it does when the ground you've been standing on turns out to have been someone else's the whole time. "This is impossible," she said, her voice rising slightly, the first genuine crack I'd heard in it in years. "Fitch would have told us. We would have known." "Fitch is the attorney who filed it," Harriet said gently. "He passed away before he could notify all the relevant parties, which is why my office only recently discovered the oversight and reached out to Mira directly." My mother turned to me, something almost pleading in her expression now. "Did you know? This whole time, did you know and just let me plan this?" "I found out 4 days ago," I said. "I have the postmark on the envelope if you'd like to see it." My uncle Rory, quiet until then, picked up the document and read it twice, his expression shifting from confusion to something almost like relief, as though a piece of his father he'd never quite understood had just clicked into place. "He always said you were the one who'd take care of it properly," Rory said, mostly to himself, setting the paper back down. Paisley said nothing at all, staring at the deed like it had personally insulted her, her jaw tight in a way that told me exactly how this particular conversation would continue once we weren't all standing in a title company waiting room. The buyer's representative, a young man clearly unprepared for any of this, closed his own folder without being asked and said, quietly, that they'd need to postpone. My mother stood up abruptly, gathering her purse with hands that weren't quite steady, and walked out of the conference room without another word to anyone. Paisley trailing a few steps behind her, still glancing back at the deed on the table, as though it might somehow rearrange itself into something less final, if she looked at it long enough. Rory stayed behind, shaking Harriet's hand, thanking her with a formality that felt almost apologetic, as though he needed to personally account for the family's behavior on everyone else's part. The developer walked away from the deal within the week, unwilling to wait through what their own attorney called a family title dispute with no clear resolution timeline. And their representative told Harriet directly, in a follow-up call, that the firm wouldn't be re-engaging with the family on any future offer, regardless of how the ownership question resolved. My mother, I later learned from Rory, had already started mentally spending a portion of the proceeds, having mentioned to a friend that she was considering a smaller condo closer to the golf course once the sale closed, a plan that evaporated along with everything else that Monday morning. The $2.3 million sale my mother had announced to 40 guests evaporated entirely, along with the closing costs and inspection fees she'd already quietly paid out of the estate's remaining shared funds, without consulting either sibling on the specific figure. $11,000. As it turned out, spent on a sale that legally never had a chance of closing, from the moment Pop signed that quitclaim deed back in 2018. Rory, once he understood the full timeline, was more upset about that unilateral spending than about the deed itself, and formally requested, through his own attorney, that my mother reimburse the estate's shared account in full from her personal funds, rather than splitting the loss 3 ways for a decision she'd made alone. She paid it back within the month, in a lump sum I only knew about because Rory mentioned it, still faintly satisfied, over a phone call. Paisley, for her part, was quietly excluded from managing any of the estate's remaining shared accounts, once Rory and I agreed privately that her repeated eagerness to sell something she'd visited twice in 6 years didn't entitle her to continued authority over money that wasn't only hers to spend. My mother didn't speak to me for 2 months. When she finally called, it wasn't an apology, exactly. More a careful accounting of her own version of events, delivered in the tone of someone still trying to locate the exact moment she'd lost control of a story she'd been narrating her whole life. I just thought, with 3 of us inheriting it, it made sense to simplify things, she said, as though the deed itself were an inconvenience rather than a decision Pop had made deliberately, years earlier, with a lawyer he trusted. I asked her, gently, whether she'd ever actually asked me what I wanted for the house, in all those months of dropping hints about upkeep and taxes. There was a long pause on the line. I suppose I assumed I already knew, she finally said, which struck me as, in its own way, the most honest sentence she'd offered me in the entire conversation. I let her talk. I didn't correct much beyond that. Some conversations aren't actually about being understood. They're about someone hearing themselves say the thing out loud for the first time. Near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Your father mentioned you've been going up to the lake since all this happened," and I told her yes, most weekends I could manage the drive. And she was quiet for a moment before saying simply, "Good. It should be used by someone who actually wants it," which was, I understood, as close to an acknowledgement as I was likely to get, and I decided to let it be enough. My father called separately, a few weeks after that, and told me, in the careful, understated way he approached most difficult subjects, that he'd known about the quitclaim deed longer than he'd let on. Pop had mentioned it to him once, years earlier, almost in passing, and asked him not to say anything to my mother until the time was right. "I think he was waiting for you to need it more than you needed to know about it," my father said. "I'm sorry I didn't push him on that. I should have told you regardless." It wasn't a large apology, but it was an honest one, and coming from my father, that mattered more than a larger one might have. He also mentioned, almost sheepishly, that he'd quietly moved a portion of his own retirement savings. Around that same year, Pop transferred the deed, something about wanting to make sure I wasn't left with property taxes on a house he suspected I'd want to keep, but might struggle to afford alone at 30. He'd never told me that either. I'm still working out how I feel about discovering, all at once, that 2 generations of men in my family had apparently been quietly planning for a future I hadn't been consulted about, however kindly intentioned the planning turned out to be. Rory and I grew closer in the months that followed, in a way that genuinely surprised me. He drove up to the lake house with me that October, just the 2 of us, and we spent a weekend repainting the boathouse door, the same door Pop had replaced twice without telling me the old key stopped working. I told Rory the story of the key. He laughed, and then didn't, and then told me he was glad it had ended up with someone who'd actually use it. We sat on the same dock, where Pop once told me I asked questions like someone planning to still be there in 40 years. And Rory admitted, quietly, that he'd always assumed the lake house would simply become someone's problem eventually, sold off and forgotten, and that some part of him was relieved it hadn't gone that way, even though the manner of it finding a permanent home had cost his own mother a fairly humbling afternoon. "Dad used to say you were the only one of us who actually listened when he explained how the septic system worked," Rory said, laughing, scraping old paint off the boathouse door with more enthusiasm than skill. The rest of us just nodded and thought about lunch. I told him I genuinely found it interesting, which made him laugh harder, and something about that easy, uncomplicated afternoon. Paint under our fingernails. Loons calling somewhere across the water, the way they always had. Felt like the first real proof that something good had actually come out of the entire ordeal, rather than just an absence of further damage. I still have the key. It sits in a small dish by my front door now, no longer around my neck, but close enough to see every morning. I open the boathouse myself, most Augusts, and I've started teaching my niece, Paisley's daughter, 12 years old this year, how to varnish a canoe the way Pop taught me, because some things, I've learned, are worth passing down deliberately rather than leaving to chance. She asked me, the first summer I brought her up, why I still wore an old key on a shoelace even though it opened a door that had been replaced years ago. And I told her the whole story, start to finish, watching her take it in with the particular seriousness 12-year-olds reserve for things they've decided matter. So the key was never really about the door, she said, working varnish carefully into the canoe's hull the way I'd shown her. It was about who Pop trusted. I told her that was exactly right, and made a private note to eventually give her a key of her own, once I found the right moment, the way Pop had once found his. Paisley doesn't come up herself, still, but she doesn't object to her daughter visiting, which I've decided to count as its own small, imperfect kind of progress. If you've ever been the one who showed up quietly for years while someone else got the credit for caring, I hope you remember this. Love doesn't always announce itself loudly, and neither does the person who actually earned what everyone else assumed was already gone. Sometimes the quietest gift is the one that was legally permanently yours the entire time. You just hadn't been told yet. I think, sometimes, about how differently that dinner might have gone if I hadn't happened to check my old mail forwarding service. If Delphine had decided the storage unit could wait another year, if either envelope had simply never found its way to me at all. My mother would have signed the papers Monday morning. And the title company's own due diligence process would likely have caught the discrepancy eventually, though probably not before the sale had already progressed far enough to cause real damage. Earnest money spent, contracts signed, a family conflict playing out in a much messier, more public way than a quiet folder placed on a conference table. I don't think Pop's letter or the deed itself changed my life in any dramatic sense. I think they simply confirmed something I'd always privately hoped was true, and gave me the paperwork to finally stop hoping and start knowing. I've thought a great deal, in the month since, about how much of my own family's story I'd simply accepted at face value for 36 years, the same way I'd never once accept a client's numbers without independently verifying them myself. I don't think that makes me foolish. I think it makes me exactly like most people who love their families, willing to extend a kind of trust at home that we'd never extend anywhere else, right up until the moment something finally forces us to check. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Has anyone in your life ever assumed they knew exactly where you stood, only to find out they'd been wrong the whole time? Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever kept something quiet, the way I kept that key, tell me what it was. We share stories like this one every day. Stories about quiet loyalty, overlooked love, and the moment someone finally discovers what was theirs all along. If you'd like to be part of that journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.